Kansas Farm, day 1945. The air is thick, warm, heavy with the smell of rich soil and cut wheat, under a vast, impossibly blue sky. A sea of golden stalks stretches to the horizon, broken only by a lone white farmhouse and a red barn. The only sound is the metallic chug of a tractor. Not a machine of war, but of creation. A John Deere Model A, its paint chipped but its engine steady, pulls a harvester through the field. At its helm sits a young man. His skin is tanned by the sun, but his posture is rigid, his hair cropped short in a distinctly military style. He is not an American farmer. His eyes, squinted against the glare, scan the horizon. No bomb craters, no shattered buildings, no blackened skeletons of tanks, just endless, peaceful abundance. He glances at his hands on the steering wheel. They are the hands of a soldier, but they now grip levers that control life, not death. For a moment, his mind drifts back across the ocean to the fatherland, to the ruins of Cologne, the starvation in Hamburg, the constant, gnawing fear his family must endure. The tractor hits a bump, jolting him back to the Kansas prairie. An American farmer, Mr. Henderson, waves from the fence line, offering a canteen of cold water. The gesture is simple, human, devoid of the hatred he was taught to expect. The POW looks out again at the bounty before him. This was the enemy he was told was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. This land of plenty, this paradise of peace. A quiet, terrifying thought begins to form, one that would make him, and thousands like him, question everything they had ever fought for. The sight of German prisoners of war working on idyllic American farms was not a spontaneous image of post-war reconciliation. It was the result of a vast, logistical and at times reluctant system born from the unyielding arithmetic of global war. By 1943, the tide of battle was turning. In North Africa, following Operation Torch, and then in Tunisia, the Allies captured tens of thousands of soldiers from Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. The question of what to do with them was urgent. British POW camps in Egypt and the United Kingdom were nearing capacity. The United States, protected by an ocean, presented a secure solution. Thus began one of the largest and least remembered population transfers of the war, the shipment of over 425,000 Axis prisoners to the United States. They arrived by train and by ship, often disembarking at the Staten Island port of New York. The first sight of America for these weary, defeated men was the soaring skyline of Manhattan, a monument to industrial power that directly contradicted Nazi propaganda of a soft, feeble democracy. They were processed, deloused, given medical exams, and issued uniforms dyed a distinctive PW khaki, a color chosen specifically to make escapees easily identifiable. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was the rigid framework governing their captivity. It stipulated that enlisted prisoners could be required to work, provided the labor was not directly related to military operations and was not unhealthy or dangerous. Officers could not be compelled to labor. This clause would become the legal bedrock for a sprawling network of labor battalions. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General, tasked with managing this immense population, established a system of base camps, often repurposed civilian conservation corps sites or military bases, with hundreds of smaller branch camps sprouting up nearby, primarily in rural areas. The initial logic was one of pure containment, but a new problem emerged. The American home front was suffering a critical labor shortage, with millions of men mobilized for war. The farms and factories that fed and supplied the Allied war machine were desperate for workers. The solution was an elegant, if ironic, marriage of problem and resource. The War Department and the Department of Agriculture launched programs to rent out POW labor to private employers. Farmers would pay the U.S. government the standard local wage, and the Army would, in turn, pay the prisoners in canteen scrip, a special currency valid only within the camp stores. This was not a humanitarian gesture. It was a cold, practical calculation. Idle prisoner were a security risk and a drain on resources. Working prisoners were self-sustaining, contributed to the war economy, and were easier to manage. Yet the American government was acutely aware of the psychological dimension. They were bringing the very embodiment of the Nazi threat onto American soil. A delicate balance had to be struck. The prisoners would work, but they would not be mistreated. They would be kept busy, but their exposure to American life would be carefully controlled. It was a policy designed for efficiency, but its unintended consequences would be profound. To comprehend the sheer disorientation experienced by the German POW in the Kansas field, one must first understand the world he left behind. He was a product of the Third Reich, a regime that had spent over a decade meticulously crafting a national identity, built on struggle, racial purity, and the myth of Blut und Boden, blood and soil. This romantic, Völkisch ideology glorified the German peasant as the racial lifeblood of the nation, tied to his ancestral land. Yet, the reality of German agriculture was one of chronic tension. The nation had never achieved true food self-sufficiency. The bitter memory of the British naval blockade during World War I, which contributed to the starvation of hundreds of thousands, was a deep national trauma. The Nazi promise was not just conquest, but autarky, total economic independence. To achieve this, the regime implemented the Reichserbhofgesetz, the hereditary farm law of 1933. This law enshrined the blood and soil ideal, preventing farms of a certain size from being sold, divided, or foreclosed upon, ensuring they remained in the hands of racially pure families. While it protected some farmers from debt, it also locked them into a system of low productivity, discouraging modernization and consolidation. The German farm in the Nazi imagination was not a business to be optimized, but a sacred fiefdom to be preserved. Furthermore, the German soldiers' diet, while sufficient at the war's outset, was Spartan and utilitarian. The Wehrmacht ran on a calculated balance of calories and morale. Black bread, potatoes, wurst, and ersatz coffee. It was fuel for the war machine, the home front. Even before the devastating Allied bombing campaigns, was subjected to strict rationing. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, framed this austerity as a noble, collective sacrifice. They portrayed the Americans as a mongrel people, corrupted by jazz, consumerism, and weak leadership. American wealth was depicted as a hollow Jewish-financed decadence that would shatter upon contact with the disciplined might of the Third Reich. The average German soldier, particularly one from a rural village or a small town, had a deeply ingrained, pre-modern view of farming. It was backbreaking labor. The sight of a horse-drawn plow was commonplace. Mechanization was rare and concentrated on the largest estates. The concept of a farm was a small plot of land worked by the entire family, its success or failure tied directly to the whims of weather and soil. This was the mental framework, the ideological armor, that the first German POWs carried with them across the Atlantic. They expected a nation struggling under the weight of war, a people softened by luxury, and a landscape that reflected the moral decay they had been taught to despise. They were prepared for hatred, for punishment, for a harsh life behind barbed wire. They were psychologically armed for all of that. What they were not prepared for was the sight of an Iowa cornfield, a Wisconsin dairy barn, or the sheer, unassailable prosperity of the American heartland. The shock was not merely one of comparison, but of cognitive dissonance so severe it threatened to unravel the very fabric of their belief system. This collision between Nazi ideology and American reality would be fought not with bullets but with tractors, full dinner pails, and the simple, undeniable evidence of a Kansas wheat field. The stage is now set. The first and most profound shock for the German POW was the simple, undeniable humanity of their captors. They had been conditioned to see the Americans as a culturally and racially inferior foe, a gangster nation of disparate, weak-willed individuals who lacked the fanatical unity of the Volksgemeinschaft, the peoples. Community, they expected brutality, contempt, and a harsh, vindictive captivity. Instead, they encountered American guards who were often too old or too young for frontline service. These were men who, by and large, displayed a casual, almost indifferent demeanor. They followed regulations, but without the rigid, ideological fervor of the SS or the Wehrmacht's professional stiffness. The guards called them Krauts, but the term often lacked venom, sounding more like a simple identifier than a slur. They shared cigarettes, tossed them chocolate bars, and communicated through a mixture of broken German, pidgin English, and universal hand gestures. This casual humanity was mirrored and often amplified by the American farmers themselves. For a farmer in Nebraska or Texas, a German prisoner was not the embodiment of the Nazi war machine. He was a pair of strong hands. The relationship was transactional, but it was conducted with a pragmatism that often bled into decency. A farmer's wife seeing a young, sunburned POW might bring out a pitcher of lemonade. A farmer, impressed by a prisoner's skill with a malfunctioning tractor engine, would slap him on the back in genuine appreciation. These were not acts of political enlightenment, but of simple, rural decency. They were gestures the POWs had been taught were impossible from the decadent enemy. For a young soldier raised in the suffocating, hierarchical structure of Nazi Germany, where every interaction was governed by rank and ideology, this American informality was bewildering. An American sergeant might joke with a private, a farmer, the boss, would work side by side with his POW laborers, sharing the same noonday meal. This flat social structure directly contradicted the Nazi worldview of a natural, rigid order. The enemy was not a monster, he was just a man, and in that realization the entire architecture of the war, as presented by Goebbels, began to crumble. The relative comfort and fairness of the POW's captivity was not accidental. It was a deliberate and strategically calculated policy enforced by the United States government. The nation had a significant interest in adhering strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention. This was not purely altruistic. It was a hard-nosed calculation for the safety of the hundreds of thousands of American and British soldiers in German hands. Mistreating German POWs would invite swift and severe reprisals against Allied captives. This policy created a system of regulated fairness that the POWs found both surprising and disarming. They were housed in barracks that, while Spartan, were weatherproof, heated and equipped with proper latrines and washing facilities, a standard far above what many knew from the Eastern Front. They received medical and dental care that was, for some, better than anything they had experienced in civilian life. Most importantly, they were fed. The U.S. Army ration for a working POW was substantial. It was designed to maintain a laborer's health and strength, and it included meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, and even luxuries like sugar and the occasional ice cream. This was not the diet of a despised enemy, it was the fuel for a productive asset. The prisoners were even paid for their labor and canteen scrip, which they could use to buy beer, cigarettes, candy, and toiletries. At the camp store, this system of regulated compensation created a bizarre semblance of normalcy. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also, in a strange way, participants in a functioning economy. This bureaucratic, almost clinical approach to captivity was a world away from the ideological fervor of the Nazi camp system. The Americans were not trying to break their spirits or annihilate them through labor. They were simply managing a resource. For the POWs, this lack of ideological hatred was confusing. They had been prepared for struggle of wills, a test of National Socialist spirit against democratic decadence. Instead, they encountered a dispassionate system that cared more about their productivity than their political beliefs. It was a form of psychological disarmament more effective than any indoctrination. If the American people failed to match the Nazi caricature, the American landscape and its technology shattered it completely. For POWs from rural backgrounds, the single Most transformative sight was the American farm itself. This was not the quaint horse drawn patchwork of the German countryside, steeped in blood and Boden mythology. This was agro-industry on a staggering, almost incomprehensible scale. The sheer size was the first shock. A single farm in Kansas or Iowa could encompass thousands of acres, a scale unimaginable in Europe, where land was measured in small, precious parcels, but it was the mechanization that truly defied belief. They saw not one, but multiple tractors on a single farm. They saw combines that harvested and threshed grain in one seamless mechanical ballet. They saw electric milking machines, automated silage conveyors, and fleets of trucks hauling produce to market on paved roads. The iconic symbol of this technological supremacy was the Ford Ferguson tractor. It was not a hulking, complicated machine, but a compact, elegant, and incredibly versatile tool. With its revolutionary three-point hitch system, it could effortlessly operate plows, harrows, and mowers. For a German soldier who had last driven a Panzer, a machine of destruction, the simple, efficient power of the Ford Ferguson was a revelation. It represented a philosophy. American power was not just for war, it was embedded in the very process of creation. This technological immersion was a continuous, silent argument against everything they had been told. Nazi propaganda spoke of German engineering supremacy, yet here was evidence of a society that had mastered mass production and applied it to the most fundamental human endeavor, feeding itself. The sight of a single American farmer sitting atop a tractor, accomplishing the work of 50 men with scythes, was a more powerful debunking of the decadent label than any radio broadcast or pamphlet. The land itself and the machines that worked it testified to a prosperity and a power that the Third Reich could not rival and could not explain away. This technological shock was inextricably linked to an even more immediate and personal experience, the daily reality of food. Beyond the machinery and the landscape, the most immediate and personal proof of American prosperity was found on the plate. The German POW diet, as mandated by the Geneva Convention and provided by the U.S. Army, was a source of profound and continuous shock for men who had known the privations of the Great Depression, the strict rationing of the Nazi home front, and the increasingly meager field rations of a losing army. The food in the American camps was nothing short of miraculous. Their daily rations were calibrated for a working man. This meant ample portions of white bread, a luxury item in Germany, where the coarse Kriegsbrot, war bread, was the norm. They received meat, real beef, pork, or chicken, not as a rare treat, but a regular component of their meals. There were vegetables, potatoes, coffee, and most astonishingly, items like oranges, bananas, and white sugar. For many, it was their first taste of a banana. The quality and quantity were consistently high, a stark contrast to the dwindling and ersatz-laden foodstuffs available to their families back in the Heimat. This abundance was weaponized, albeit subtly, by their captors. The Americans understood the psychological impact of a full stomach. A well-fed prisoner was a docile prisoner, but the effect went far beyond mere docility. The reliable, high-quality nutrition was a constant, tangible refutation of Nazi propaganda. How could this be the nation on the verge of economic collapse? How could these be the people who were supposed to be softened by luxury? The POWs were not just eating better than they had in years. They were eating better than they ever had in their lives. The experience was often compounded by the generosity of the farmers they worked for. It was common for a farmer's wife to provide a hot, home-cooked midday meal. Prisoner might find himself eating fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and apple pie, a feast of almost mythical proportions. This act of sharing food, a universal symbol of community and care, further blurred the lines between enemy and fellow human being. The message was undeniable. The decadent enemy lived in a state of plenty that the master race could scarcely imagine. The full dinner pail became a more powerful argument for American democracy than any political lecture could ever be. The cumulative effect of these shocks, the humane treatment, the technological marvels, the abundant food, catalyzed a deep internal crisis that struck at the very heart of Nazi ideology, the myth of Aryan superiority. The POWs were living, breathing contradictions to their own indoctrination. They had been taught they were the Herrenfolk, the master race, destined to rule over Untermenschen, subhumans in the East, and defeat the culturally bankrupt plutocracies in the West. Yet here they were, prisoners of the very people they were supposed to dominate, and their captors were not the weak, degenerate caricatures of Nazi posters. The American guards and farmers were, by and large, well-fed, confident, and physically robust. They displayed a casual competence with technology that bordered on the magical. They lived in a land of staggering wealth and peace. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. The ideology insisted they were superior. But the evidence of their senses, the tractors, the food, the unharmed cities, screamed the opposite. The American South presented a particular challenge to their racial dogma. Hardline Nazis among the prisoners were scandalized to see black Americans driving trucks, operating machinery, and in some cases, even serving as their armed guards. The sight of a black man with a rifle possessing authority over a white German soldier was an affront to their entire worldview, yet this same guard might treat them with a detached professionalism, further complicating their racist conditioning. The informal, democratic nature of American society was the final blow. In the camp and on the farm, they saw a world where rank did not always command automatic deference, where initiative was valued over blind obedience, and where a common laborer could own a car. This stood in stark contrast to the rigid, militarized hierarchy of the Third Reich, where every aspect of life was subordinated to the state and the Führer. The American way of life, in its unassuming daily practice, demonstrated a strength derived from freedom and individualism, not from collective fanaticism. For many POWs, the Thousand-Year Reich began to look not just defeatable, but fundamentally flawed. A grim and impoverished path compared to the open road of America. This internal ideological collapse, fostered over months and years of captivity, would culminate in a single, defining moment of choice when the war in Europe finally ended. May 7, 1945, the news crackled over camp loudspeakers and was passed in hushed tones between work details. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In camps across the United States, a strange, subdued silence fell. There were no cheers from the German compounds. For these men, the end of the fighting was not a liberation but a catastrophic national collapse. The world they had known, the cause for which they had fought and their comrades had died, was now officially a lost and criminal enterprise. The fatherland lay in utter ruin, occupied by foreign armies. The initial reaction for many was a profound despair, a deep anxiety for the families they had left behind. But as the initial shock wore off, a new and startling sentiment began to emerge, particularly among those who had spent significant time on American farms. It was not a desire to return home, it was a fear of it, the thought of going back to the bombed-out cities. The famine, the chaos, and the shame of a defeated nation was, for many, a more terrifying prospect than remaining in captivity. This was the great turning point. The barbed wire, which had once symbolized their imprisonment, now began to feel like a perverse form of protection inside the camp. They had 3 meals a day, a clean cot, and security. Outside the camp's fence in the direction of Europe lay only uncertainty and misery. The American farm was no longer just a place of work, it had become a sanctuary. The choice to refuse repatriation was not an act of political defiance against the defeated Nazi regime, nor was it a sudden, fervent conversion to American ideals. It was, for most, a deeply pragmatic calculation. It was a choice between a known, stable, and full-bellied present and a future in a shattered wasteland. The U.S. military authorities, however, were not prepared for this phenomenon. Their Mandate was clear: process and repatriate the POWs as swiftly as possible. The camps were needed for other purposes, and the political imperative was to return these enemy soldiers to their homeland. A massive logistical machine swung into action, but it was met with a baffling resistance. Prisoners began to file formal petitions. They wrote letters to camp commanders. They asked simply to be allowed to stay. Some, in a desperate bid to buy time, even volunteered for additional labor details, proving their continued usefulness. The unthinkable was happening. Men were refusing their own freedom. This presented the American authorities with an unprecedented dilemma. They could not simply force these men to leave at gunpoint. That would violate the very principles they had upheld throughout the war. Yet, they also could not allow hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers to remain indefinitely. A system had to be created to manage this quiet rebellion, to sift the genuinely reluctant from the merely opportunistic, and to navigate the treacherous political waters of post-war policy. The process of determining who could stay and why would become a bureaucratic and psychological battleground, formalizing the most profound choice these men would ever make. Faced with a growing number of POWs expressing a desire to delay or refuse repatriation, the U.S. government was forced to create a formal and often fraught screening process. This was not a simple administrative task. It was a delicate operation, conducted under the watchful eyes of the Soviet Union, which demanded the return all its citizens from German uniform and the new, fragile authorities in occupied Germany, who needed every able-bodied man for reconstruction. The process began inside the camps. Teams of officers, often accompanied by interpreters and, later, representatives from the British and French governments, conducted interviews. The atmosphere was tense, charged with a mixture of hope and suspicion. The primary question was deceptively simple: did the prisoner wish to be repatriated immediately, or did he have objections? For the POW, this was a moment of supreme risk. To voice an objection was to make a definitive stand, with consequences he could not fully foresee. The screeners were not just looking for a yes or no. They were tasked with determining the validity of the prisoner's claim. The most common and most credible objections fell into several categories. A significant number were prisoners whose homes now lay within the newly redrawn borders of Poland or the Soviet Union. These men, often from East Prussia, Silesia, or the Sudetenland, were now stateless. Returning home meant being handed over to the Soviets or Poles, a prospect that promised not just displacement, but likely imprisonment, forced labor, or execution. For them, refusal was a matter of survival. Others were ardent anti-Nazis who could provide evidence of their political leanings. Perhaps a history of conflict with camp hardliners, or membership in pre-1933 political parties. They feared persecution not from the Allies, but from their own countrymen. The chaotic aftermath of defeat. Then there were the men whose motivation was purely economic. They articulated simple, powerful truth. They had no future in the rubble of Germany, but they had seen a land of limitless opportunity. They spoke of the farms, the machinery, the food. They argued that their skills as mechanics, carpenters, or farmers could be of value in America. They were, in effect, pitching themselves as future immigrants. The screeners had to be detectives of human intention, separating genuine fear and pragmatic calculation from those who were simply trying to extend their comfortable captivity. The decision was momentous. A stamp of approval on a form could mean a new life. A denial meant a one-way ticket to a displaced persons camp and a shattered Europe. For those whose objections were sustained, a new, paradoxical status emerged. They became volunteers who were, in fact, remaining prisoners. They were transferred to special camps or designated compounds where they lived in a state of legal limbo. They continued to work, often on the same farms, but now the shadow of the future loomed larger. They were no longer prisoners of war awaiting the end of a conflict. They were men in a queue waiting for a different world to decide their fate. the war had been over. For months, sometimes years, but their personal armistice was yet to come. This bureaucratic filtering process created two distinct streams of humanity, one flowing back across the Atlantic to face the grim reality of a destroyed nation, and another smaller stream waiting in anxious hope on the American shore. The true meaning of their choice would only become clear when these two paths diverged completely. The journey home, for those who took it, would be a shock that would validate every fear that had led the others to stay. For the vast majority of German POWs, repatriation was not a choice, but an inevitability. Between 1945 and 1946, a massive fleet of Liberty ships that had once carried tanks to Europe now carried human cargo back, hundreds of thousands of former soldiers. The journey across the Atlantic was a voyage from a land of plenty to a continent of want. The first sight of Europe was often the port of Le Havre, France, a shattered skeleton of a city. Upon disembarkation, the contrast was immediate and brutal. They were processed through Allied transit camps, where the rations were meager and the conditions crowded. The final leg of the journey, often by train through the French and German countryside, was a panoramic vision of devastation. They passed through cities that were no more than fields of rubble, where the smell of dust and decay hung heavy in the air. Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, names they knew as vibrant centers of culture, were now lunar landscapes. Arriving in their hometowns and villages, they encountered a reality far grimmer than their worst fears. This was the stunned null zero hour. The economy was non-existent. Operating on a system of barter and the black market, the currency was all but worthless. Housing was a desperate crisis, with families crammed into cellars or single rooms of bomb-damaged buildings. Most crushing of all was the food situation. The official ration in the American and British zones provided a mere 1,500 calories per day, often less, and it was frequently unavailable. The population survived on what they could grow, scavenge, or trade. The hunger winter of 1946-47 claimed thousands of lives. The returning POW was a ghost at this feast of misery. He was another mouth to feed, a reminder of a lost war. His stories of America, of tractors, steaks, and ice cream, sounded like fantastical, almost cruel lies. He was a man out of time, displaced not just geographically but psychologically. The discipline and order of the Wehrmacht were useless here. Survival required a different, more desperate kind of cunning. Many found their families broken, their homes destroyed, and their pre-war skills irrelevant. The psychological toll was immense, leading to what would later be recognized as a form of traumatic alienation, a profound disconnect from the very homeland they had fought to defend. Letters began to trickle back to the United States from these men to their former captors and farmers. They were pleas for help. They described the starvation, the hopelessness. They asked for care packages, for food, for clothing, for any shred of the abundance they had once known. These letters were not just requests for aid, they were stark, first-hand validations of the choice their comrades had made. For the POWs who had stayed behind in America, news from home did not breed nostalgia. It bred a grim sense of vindication and a reinforced determination to never return. For the several thousand German POWs whose objections to repatriation were sustained, the wait was long and uncertain. They remained in U.S. Army custody for years, a lingering artifact of a concluded war, their futures held in bureaucratic suspension. It was not until 1947, with the passage of the first War Powers Act, that the legal pathway was cleared for them to be paroled into the United States. The process was slow, deliberate, and required sponsors, often the very farmers for whom they had worked. Their release was not a grand celebration, but a quiet, administrative transition. A former prisoner would be met at the camp gate by a farmer from Kansas or Alabama, who would vouch for him and provide initial housing and employment. The transition from POW to paid farmhand was seamless in its labor, but profound in its meaning. The Barbed wire was gone, but the landscape was the same. They were now free men in the country they had once been sent to conquer. Their integration into American society was a remarkable, though often unspoken, chapter of post-war history. They brought with them a strong work ethic, valuable skills, and a deep appreciation for the opportunity they had been given. Many eventually applied for and received U.S. citizenship, formally severing their ties to a nation that no longer existed as they remembered it. They married, raised families, and became taxpayers and community members. Their stories, however, were often kept quiet. The wounds of the war were too fresh for public celebration of former enemy soldiers, and many preferred to bury their past, focusing instead on building their future. The impact of this mass POW experience rippled outward in subtle but significant ways. For the American farming communities that had hosted them, the encounter demystified the enemy. The Kraut became Hans, or Karl, a hard worker who loved his family and his homeland. It fostered a grassroots, personal diplomacy that ran counter to the official hatreds of war. This exposure also had a modernizing effect on some American agricultural practices. The Germans brought techniques from their own farming traditions, and their presence forced a greater, if localized, cultural exchange. Most importantly, the program served as a powerful, if unintended, psychological weapon during the early stages of the Cold War. As tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, the United States could point to its treatment of POWs as a testament to the values of the free world. The defections and refusals to repatriate were framed not as a rejection of Germany, but as a choice for freedom and prosperity over tyranny and destruction. The German POW who chose to stay became an early symbol in the ideological battle for hearts and minds, a living rebuttal to communist propaganda about American imperialism and cruelty. The legacy of these men is not found in monuments or history books, but in the quiet, enduring fabric of rural American life. It is a legacy written not in grand declarations, but in the simple, enduring act of choosing to build rather than return to destroy. The story of the German POWs who refused to go home is, on its surface, a paradox. It is a war story where the most decisive battle was not fought with bullets, but with bread, where the most powerful weapon was not a bomb, but a barn, and where the ultimate surrender was not of a nation, but of a deeply held lie. This quiet chapter of World War II challenges our simplest notions of loyalty and enemy. It reveals that the human spirit, even when encased in the armor of ideology, remains vulnerable to the simple, undeniable truths of decency and prosperity. These men were not traitors, they were witnesses. They had seen the grim future that awaited them, the ashes of the Third Reich, and they had seen an alternative in the fields of America. Their choice was a raw, human calculation, a vote for survival, for full stomachs, for chance at life. In the end, their story transcends the specific politics of Nazism and American democracy. It becomes a universal lesson about the foundations of belief and ideology. Built on hatred and falsehoods can command armies, but it cannot withstand the quiet, persistent evidence of a well-tended field, a shared meal, or a simple act of kindness. The American farm, in its unassuming abundance, became the ultimate debunker of propaganda, proving that the most powerful force in the world is not the will to destroy, but the capacity to create. The legacy of these men is a whisper from the past, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the seeds of a different future are being sown in the most unexpected of places. It is a testament to the fact that the most profound revolutions are not always marked by the fall of walls, but by the quiet, personal decision to no longer believe in them.